Well, hello and welcome to episode 158 of the Play the Counts podcast series, where every week we get together and discuss the upcoming gospel election. As always, I'm joined with my co-host, Alicia McClintic. Alicia, how are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing all right. Coming out of Young Clergy Conference here on the West
Hmm.
Coast. So those who are watching the video will know that I'm not in the office today. I'm taking some comp time, staying at home. Just being on the planning team, executing and hosting this conference was such a joy and also so much work.
Hmm.
But the kind of work that I'm thrilled and grateful to do is such an amazing gathering of young clergy, and our advocates, some students from Point Loma. It was like such a wonderful and beautiful time
Wow,
together. So
that's amazing. I so wish I could have been there. Uh,
yeah, we missed you, man.
Yeah, I missed being there. Well, thanks so much for all the work that you did with your team and everything to make that happen. I've only heard good things so far, so that's awesome.
Yeah, we also have somebody who's censoring all the bad things.
Oh, that's good. Yeah,
Just
that's
kidding. Just
important.
kidding. um,
Well,
well, good. I'm so glad that you've heard good things.
yeah.
And it was such a joy to meet some regular listeners to the podcast. It's
Hmm.
just like so encouraging to know that even this collaboration,
Hmm.
I think you and I first met at the first Young
Yeah.
Clergy Conference. And so to see the ways that that this resource has developed from just like getting people in the same room together
Yeah.
is,
So
yeah.
important and so rare in the days of technology to have those in-person spaces. So that's wonderful to hear.
Yeah. So
Um,
grateful for all the fruit that is grown and looking forward to more and more that
yeah,
continues to grow there.
me too. Me too.
Yeah.
Well, this week we have moved from the parable of the widow before the unjust judge, which I just benefited. I'm still reeling from that conversation from last week, thinking about black eyes and the uh, persistence against injustice and the faithfulness there. I just loved that conversation. We're moving into a new parable from Jesus between the Pharisee, a conversation between the Pharisee and the tax collector. And Jesus is talking about something important for us to understand in this contrast. Let me read first the verses for us from Luke 18. I'll be reading verses 9 through 14 from the NIV version. Listen to these words. To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all those who humble themselves will be exalted. The written word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God. So Luke kind of gives us this generality of who's being spoken to here. To some who were confident in their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else. That's who Jesus was talking to. Like, we don't even get a context. Like, kind of just jumps from the persistent widow to this parable to this new kind of audience of people. So it could be the mix of the disciples. Like, who knows who they're speaking to? But Luke is very poignant about to those who are confident in their own righteousness and look
Yeah.
down on everyone else.
Yeah, it's a pointed and indicting statement.
It
I
really
have the
is.
NRSV today, and it phrases it this way: to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Like
Mhm.
that's sharp.
It is very sharp and very applicable to us today still. Like, it's not, it's,
Totally.
uh,
Totally. Uh, yeah. I love my faithful and beautiful and compassionate church people, but this sounds like a parable for church people.
yeah, it
Um,
really does.
yeah. And I think it takes some humility and some graciousness to receive this kind of feedback, right?
Yeah.
Like this is a teaching moment that Jesus is taking among his people, to say, look, you think you've got it together,
Right.
but pay attention,
Yeah.
be wary of that.
Mm-hmm.
um, and then he sets up this, he tells this like exaggerated, like hyperbolic story. It's like a snapshot that's like a caricature. I think you reminded us last week of this like widow and judge moment as being kind of like a political cartoon.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm feeling the same kind of way about this parable. Like this is a snapshot that's like a caricature. It's super exaggerated, right?
Yeah.
And so we have this Pharisee who's like, oh, thank God I'm not like these other people. and
Yes.
then and then we have the tax collector who's like, woe is me, I'm the worst in the history of ever.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so like those who are like that's the kind of sound or
Mm-hmm.
feeling about this picture here. And
For
those who
sure.
are listening don't know anybody like this tax collector, don't
Right.
know anybody like this Pharisee. It's
Mm-hmm.
like it's obnoxiously exaggerated on purpose,
Right.
but to kind of draw our attention to some particular things that are maybe more subtle and nuanced in our regular faith and life practice. And I
Mm-hmm.
think Jesus wants us to pay attention to the subtleties of our lives by drawing our attention to these like exaggerated moments.
Yeah. Yeah.
If that makes
That's
sense.
that's so good. Because in these exaggerations, like there's so much not said. Like
Yeah.
there's so many like details that we don't really know. So like he may say that he fasts twice a week and gives a tenth of all he has, but does he? Or is he just saying that for like part of the parable leads me to believe he says this because the public affirmation of his righteousness is what he's after. So wouldn't he just say anything that kind of makes that happen, right?
Right.
So that who knows if that's like absolutely truthful or whatever. And then if you think of the tax collectors who tax the people heavily and keep a lot for themselves, there's that contrast there from a person who gives to God to a person who takes from God's people. you know um, so there's just a lot of details here that are kind of left out that kind of
Yeah.
add to the hyperbolic nature of this. This
Yeah. I'm wondering a little bit also what like Luke, the writer and compiler and
Right.
storyteller who offers us this story from Jesus. I'm wondering what he is thinking or how he's framing this, because we know some other stories about people who have kind of publicly proclaimed their goodness and righteousness. Think about Ananias and Sapphira from Acts, who sold a field and said they were giving all of the money to the church, but kept some for themselves. They come in to the church and drop dead. um, I recently preached that story as my congregation has been working through the book of Acts this year. And one of the things that stuck out to me there is this like overwhelming pressure to perform a very particular kind of spirituality,
Hmm.
right? That there is a certain way that we judge faithfulness, and spiritualness and righteousness and God lovingness. Like there's this image that's upheld, right? And this Pharisee is doing exactly that, like
Hmm.
living into this image and performance that's kind of expected of somebody who's going to be like the most
Right.
faithful people fast twice a week. The most faithful people give 10%. The
Hmm.
most faithful people are like this. And there's like some of these external markers by which we can judge. And I just think that ends up being so dangerous to the life of the faith community, right? Like fast forward to
Right.
Ananias and Sapphira, these are like bookended in Luke's storytelling, right? Because
Hmm.
when we've held up a certain example of what faithfulness looks like, and it's always the same kind of example, right? When it
Yeah.
centers around fasting and tithing in this particular way, then when we have people who desperately long to be faithful, um, it I don't know, it just puts this like this insane performance pressure
Mm,
on the life of faith that I think ends up being really insidious and problematic to the
right.
people, right? It emphasizes these external markers rather than the heart of people, right?
That's
Because I
so
don't think
good.
you get to this like kind of life where you're giving 10% away or you're fasting twice a week without a foundation of persistent, consistent, desperate prayer
Hmm.
or abundant, faithful, extravagant generosity. Like we start there with those foundations
Right.
to feed into a life that where you fast twice a week and give 10%
Hmm.
away. But if we start from that reverse direction, from the like quantified, codified way that looks, then
Hmm.
I think we miss like the heart and the foundation.
Yeah.
um yeah, I'm just not entirely sure we can reverse engineer a faithful, uh disciplined,
Hmm.
um spiritual life.
Right.
I think sometimes um, practices can shape us into the truth, or can teach us, inform us, or can function like a trellis in some ways that guides our faithful life
Hmm.
and work. But I don't know. I guess I'm just trying to point out like Jesus seems to be critiquing a particular image of faithfulness
Hmm.
that's then become insidious to real, meaningful, rooted discipleship. Does
Right.
that make sense?
Yeah, it totally does. Well, as you were describing that, it just uh, kind of brought to mind this idea of, it still really happens today where we take really good things, and yet the way that we give them to the next generation or pass them down drives them away from God or drives them away
Mm.
from the church. And so, like, uh, the legalism that can happen from passing that down from one generation to the next, if it's not given to them with the reason behind it and the deep love for them, and to really instill in them like, this is for your best and this is because I love you. It starts with that genuine loving relationship and learning at a step at a time, rather than like as you said, like putting fasting twice a week and tithing a tenth of all you have right from the get-go, without like, why? Where is the why, and how are we answering that through relationship? And how many of our peers have been driven away from the church because all they hear is rigid legalism without really the spirit or the heart or the relationship behind it. And it feels like that's kind of what Jesus is speaking to in that context, that there's this just crushing. And I want you to speak a little bit about privilege here as well, like these crushing expectations of religious life on people who have no means or resources of fitting that, from and being told by people from positions of privilege. And Jesus is coming along and saying, where's the relationship here? Where is
Exactly.
the spirit? Because you're using, really, like, tithing and fasting are good things, but you're using it to drive people away from God. Like, so what, where's the truth here?
Right. Oh gosh, yeah. I want to come back to a conversation about privilege, but just
Hmm.
to echo and affirm some of the things that you've brought to the table in our discussion today, I think that we know this deeply in our own tradition. Not all of our listeners, of course, are from the Church of the Nazarene, where you and I
Hmm.
both pastor, but we have seen that example of faithfulness that was contextual and rooted in certain communities, right? Like we make jokes about Nazarenes who don't drink or don't dance, and yeah, they're like, I don't know, sing-songy rhymes about not drinking or dancing or going
Hmm.
around with those who do.
Yeah.
uh, and and that's sort of like, that's exactly this generational passing down of tradition without story that you were just telling us about, right? Like those practices grew up from a life of faithful service to those who were struggling with addiction, or all sorts of things, right? So as part of this holiness tradition, the Church of the Nazarene sought to model a different way of being in the world that was in service of the least and the last and the lowly and the hurting, and all of these kinds of things. But then when that just becomes a practice or a rule and loses its story, loses its roots, loses its foundation, then we end up with sing-songy rhymes about like, we're the people who don't do those things, and aren't we better than the people who do? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And sure, that's not everybody's story, but it's hard to read a parable like this and not think contextually about like the ways that has happened.
No, that's so good. Because then, I mean, that feeds into the important conversation I think we're going to move to next, is like, when you understand yourself to be good, like to be better than whoever that group of people are, doesn't that then say you're assuming a more privileged proximity to God because of those things, when it doesn't even give us a proper, like, does anyone have a privileged position in proximity to God? Anyone?
Totally.
Jesus is condemning this right here, like assuming this close relationship with God. Like, thank you, Lord. Like, imagine being so buddy with God that you're like, hey God, thanks so much that I'm not like that. Like that assumes a lot. And God's like, whoa, this is super awkward, because I don't know where you're coming from with this sort of mentality. Because like, the reason why I sent Jesus Christ is because nobody is able to like get here, and you're assuming that you have that position, and I want everyone here, like all y'all, all the people here. And it's just such a backward notion. It seems like Jesus is saying those who are advocating and assuming this position with God are the ones who are furthest from God.
Yeah, I have found in my own life, from like humble pie in the face, that the second I think that I have God figured out is the very same second I've got it wrong.
Right.
Or that anytime I catch a revelation of who God is and what God is up to in the world, that ought to be simultaneously encouraging and indicting, right? That it's at once a beautiful gift and a concrete and difficult call to continue to lean into a life of faithfulness.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think maybe to like concretely talk about like privilege from this passage, I think there's the trifecta of race, class, and gender when we talk about privilege and the ways that those intersect. But like, just, I mean, concretely from the passage, this tax collector Pharisee contrast, like the Pharisee is saying, look at me, I fast twice a week and I give 10% away. There are people who can't afford to fast twice a week because they're already starving, right? Or they're already struggling to have food on the table. So the kind of people who can willingly choose to give up 2 days of food is like, that's already a privileged economic position, to name that concretely. Or to like, the kind of people who can afford to give 10% away is already a privileged economic position. This isn't to say that those who have fewer economic resources are unable to be generous. I serve a group of people like that who are faithfully, abundantly generous with what they have, but it's not 10% of their income. That's impossible, right? But they are growing to be a generous, compassionate, faithful people, and I'm so proud to serve them. Never in my life would I insist that they give 10%, right? That's not what it's about. That's not what faithful discipleship means. Faithful discipleship is naming that we serve a God of abundant generosity, and so we are formed and shaped to be a generous people. And just like that subtle difference is I think is a way to create space for people like the community that I serve that lack financial resources to
Mm-hmm.
grow in a kind of abundant and faithful generosity,
Mm-hmm.
rather than saying like 10% or you're not doing it right.
Right. Right. That's so good.
And then on the flip side, right, like there are folks in the Bay Area. So I happen to pastor a community that's short on economic resources, but there are communities that are flush with economic
Mm-hmm.
resources, and I don't think we're doing faithful work if we're not calling them to be like sacrificially generous, like
Mm-hmm.
there is a privileged position here where 10% doesn't even touch you. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Right.
And so I don't think we're doing faithful discipling work if we're not calling people to abundant and sacrificial
Mm-hmm.
generosity,
Mm-hmm.
however and whatever that looks like.
Right.
So those are just some notes that I would say about economic privilege. But I think in light of some of the broader conversations in our current climate, I think we also need to talk about race and gender
Mm-hmm.
privilege too. There's been a video floating around from a prominent evangelical leader who I won't name. The video does not deserve more clicks. I hope it is buried in the internet.
Mm-hmm.
But I have, in response, seen a lot of my colleagues who are men saying, "Thank goodness we're not like those people," um, and and then like in the Church of the Nazarene saying, "Oh, thank goodness we've been supporting women since before women had the right to vote." That's not wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yet there is so much work to do. There's so much still to do. And I think the very second we say, "Thank goodness I'm not like those people," is the
Mm-hmm.
very second we miss an opportunity to really concretely lean into justice work,
Mm-hmm.
right? I guess like those folks I'm seeing who respond to a comment like telling a woman leader and preacher and teacher and biblical scholar to go home, and they say, "I would never say that." Like, well, you sit at tables with people who do say that and think that
Mm-hmm.
and feel that, and are you doing the work to call it out, or are you
Mm-hmm.
just posting something on Facebook to say like, "Thank goodness I'm not like those people"?
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
are you doing the work to create like space for others who are excluded from the table? Are you showing up, staying humble, doing the work? Because there's
Mm-hmm.
so much still to be done. So that's a little bit preachy. Sorry to be on a soapbox, but it's hard not to hear those echoes in this passage
Mm-hmm.
when I open up Facebook and like hear the conversations around me this week. I think, and then sort of secondarily, we see this a lot in our conversations from woke white folk. Thank goodness I'm not like those people.
Mm-hmm.
And and we have to keep showing up. We have to keep staying humble. We have to keep doing the work. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I'm growing in that journey. I'm growing in that work. Again, to quote Paul, not that I consider myself to have arrived, but I hope I'm continuing to stay humble, show up, do the work, receive with gratitude God's abundant grace, and keep on keeping on.
Mm-hmm. Because I think the tendency after we hear this parable is to lump the Pharisees into the group of the evildoers and say, "I'm so glad I'm not like that Pharisee," and that's exactly what Jesus is trying to keep us away from, is to elevate ourselves, because he ends the whole parable by saying, "For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled." And I've heard the term humble brag before, but like that's so much of, I hear that a lot, and to affirm what you're saying, like this desire to speak out or whatever, even against legitimate injustice. There's this subtle like, "Oh, look at the how clean," and exalt ourselves in the midst of that, I think is really a lot of the threads that we see in our cultural Christianity, and so any time that we're exalting ourselves, even especially when we think we're being humble, I think is the crux there. And so the ones who humble themselves and say, "Oh my gosh, like how can I learn from this? How how am I reflecting on my role? How am I reflecting on my character? And like, and not like approaching things through elevate, like taking every opportunity to not elevate yourself, because I think it's just really easy to do that. Um, and so coming away from this parable with this desire for humility, I think is the desire for every preacher who comes to preach this parable, is that they want their people to hear that call to humility, and call to that freedom in Christ to be humble, call to that freedom to Christ to not have to exalt ourselves because it's not based on our work, but that the work does flow out of that genuine relationship, and you'll be set free to do that in joy. um, is a big takeaway for me.
Yeah, that's so good. I think also maybe a note to like our liturgical calendar,
Mm-hmm.
liturgical season. We're coming up on Reformation Sunday, and what better passage to bring to your people other than like continue to be reformed,
Yeah,
reformed in the
yeah.
image of God, in the image of Christ, the image of Christ who didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped or held onto, but gave it up and took on the very nature of a servant.
Mm-hmm.
Like what better way to speak about a continuous ongoing conversion, a continuous life of growing
Yeah,
in wholeness and holiness,
right.
than to say like none of us have arrived.
Yeah,
And yet the invitation is to continue to follow, to continue to press into God, to continue to let our minds and hearts and direction
mm-hmm.
be shaped and formed by who God is and who God is calling us to be.
Right. um, well, that's great. I feel like there's so many avenues and tangible concrete examples that you've spoken about that we could use to preach this Sunday to make it um, accessible to our listeners. But do you have any final thoughts on maybe ways to speak this parable that doesn't result in especially exalting the preacher?
Mm,
those who preach this text, it's like you really need to be humble, like to preach humility, like one's got to be living it before they ever come behind the pulpit to preach this, and so any
yeah.
final thoughts on that?
I don't know. I guess I would say to our preachers and pastors who are listening, you know your people best. So name the examples of faithfulness that you see,
Yeah.
and and do it with intention so that they're diverse examples, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like this is the cookie cutter version of faithfulness, but name Al and Peggy and
Mm-hmm.
and Andrea and Lorenzo and Luis, like just like name them
Mm-hmm.
and name the ways that you see your people embodying
Mm-hmm.
faithfulness.
Yeah.
Um, and especially the ones you know that would never humble brag.
Right.
You know those people, they're
Mm-hmm.
in your communities, like
Yeah.
they're the ones that show up always with like an extra dish to share at the
Yeah.
potluck, right? Like the ones who make sure there's extra toilet paper in the bathrooms without being asked,
Yeah.
you know the people in your community who are doing that faithful
Mm-hmm.
work, and you see it week in and week out. So to find a way to tell the stories of your people
Mm-hmm.
and in a way that helps them see with this vision that Jesus is
Yeah.
forming for us, right?
Right.
Where that's the work that Jesus is trying to do among his people here in this story. He's trying to
Mm-hmm.
say, you think you know what faithfulness looks like. Let me tell you. Let
Right.
me tell you more.
Right.
Faithfulness looks like a widow who's seeking justice. Faithfulness looks like little children.
Yeah.
Faithfulness looks like a humble tax collector, right? Like Jesus is doing this work to reframe and reshape our imaginations.
Mm-hmm.
So do that work among your own people.
Right.
Help them see themselves in that way,
Right.
and offer an invitation to continue to
Mm-hmm.
keep showing up, keep staying humble, keep doing the work.
Yeah. That's so good. As you were speaking that truth, my mind went to the times in which I've heard um, either from my sisters or um, you know minorities in ministry around me, in my peers, and they are talking about a success in their ministry, and my mind could immediately jump to, oh, like, why are you bragging about that, blah blah blah. But then I get like, the spirit seems to come right in my face and like, really, white boy, you're gonna downplay what they're celebrating in your ministry? And because so often I hear people, because this can be flipped around, and when you hear people talk about success in their life or
Mm,
something they're taking joy in, and you're like, oh, that's elevating yourself still by condemning that like
mm,
celebration. Like, what if you heard that as an opportunity to say, what if they've like never received affirmation ever in their life, and this is a way that they're actually asking for it, they don't know how to ask, maybe no one is listening
mm,
to answer that for them. And what if you're the person that comes up and says, oh my gosh, I am just blown away by you? And like, what what's it gonna hurt to go up and like affirm that and celebrate that, and to get out of your own way and be humble rather than exalt yourself? Because the deepest understanding of white male privilege is to understand that you are already exalted. You are already in a culture that exalts you. And so from that position, while you're trying to deconstruct those positions that build you up, you also need to understand that when you hear it, it's from an exalted position already. And so how you speak and how you understand and hear these other things, are you going to take that as a opportunity to even exalt yourself even more, or to celebrate? Because I just feel like it's such a common issue to hear other things, and like, do you really even have the right to condemn
mm.
when you hear other people celebrate what's going on?
Yeah, I have a friend who has just like a really amazing spiritual practice. He says, "Amen to your life," right? Like
Yeah,
when people are celebrating those really good and beautiful things as gifts from God, he
yeah,
says, "Amen to your life." Like,
that's so good.
yes, yes, and so be it. Like I think that's a practice we can easily adopt in the spirit of this parable, in the spirit of Christ,
Hmm.
to just like in the same ways that I hope we're prophetically speaking truth to power, I hope we are also saying amen to your life, to these
Yep,
lives of faithfulness.
yep, amen.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. These conversations are always so helpful for my own personal exegesis of the passage and inspiration for preaching. Thank you so much for the insight you always bring to these conversations, Alicia.
Thanks, Ben. It's always a joy. And so we hope this is like a helpful conversation for others as well. It's always sweet to imagine like friends and colleagues joining in the
Hmm.
conversation as we just open the text to see what it has to say for us.
Absolutely. And friends and colleagues, as you're listening, if you can give us your feedback on where you're headed, especially towards the season of Advent through maybe even All Saints Day, Reformation Sunday, we are really curious. Let us know how the shape of your ministry is going forward into the next seasons. We'd really like to speak on pertinent passages that you will be going through. And so if the majority of you are going through the epistle or the Old Testament or the Psalm rather than the gospel, please let us know, and we'd love to tailor the podcast accordingly. We thrive on your feedback. Sign up for the newsletter, follow us on all those social media outlets, and we look forward to seeing you next week as we continue these discussions on the scripture that shapes our life. Go in the name of Christ.